Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that's close to my heart, Indigenous America.
Oh, an excellent choice.
I've been poring over excerpts from the American Yawp, and I'm already amazed by how much there is to uncover.
Yeah, it's a real eye-opener.
It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the Americas before Columbus.
For sure, it challenges that whole New World idea. I mean, these lands were already home to complex societies, diverse cultures, and
And they were thriving for thousands of years before Europeans ever set foot there.
absolutely. We often focus on the arrival of Europeans, but
But there's so much more to the story.
exactly.
Did you know the Salinan people of California have this incredible creation story about a bald eagle shaping the first humans from clay and a feather?
Oh, yeah, I love that one. It's so evocative. It really speaks to their deep connection with nature.
It gives you a glimpse into their worldview,
Yeah.
right? And it's a reminder that their spirituality was so interwoven with their daily lives.
And with the environment, I mean, that's a key difference we see between many indigenous cultures and the Europeans who arrived later.
That's one of the things the American Yawp really gets into the whole concept of land ownership.
Yeah, for many Native Americans, land wasn't something you could just own.
Right. It was more about a shared responsibility, a relationship with the land.
A relationship, yeah, not ownership.
Which, as you can imagine, led to some pretty serious clashes when Europeans showed up with their very different ideas about property.
Oh, absolutely. Major clashes.
It's mind-blowing to think about the sheer variety of lifestyles that existed across indigenous America, too.
Oh, the diversity is incredible.
You had Northwest tribes who depended on salmon fishing, nomadic bison hunters on the Great Plains.
And then you had the settled agricultural communities in the eastern woodlands.
Each one adapted to its environment in fascinating ways. It's a reminder that Native American isn't some monolithic category.
Right, it's an umbrella term for hundreds of distinct cultures.
Exactly. They had unique languages, forms of governance, and ways of life that were shaped by their surroundings.
And they're incredibly innovative, too.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Take the Three Sisters method of planting corn, beans, and squash together.
Brilliant, isn't it?
Talk about sustainable farming. It's not just about having a balanced meal. It's about maximizing yields and working with nature.
And, agriculture had a ripple effect on society, too. It allowed for larger, more settled communities, which then led to...
More complex social structures, like Chaco Canyon, that Puebloan site with those massive buildings that housed thousands of people.
Chaco Canyon is fascinating.
It really is. And those weren't just simple dwellings either. They were designed with astronomical alignments, showing a deep understanding of the cosmos.
It makes you realize how much we still don't know, right?
Totally. It challenges those simplistic notions we often have about pre-Columbian societies.
For sure. And then there's Cahokia. Have you heard about Cahokia?
Oh, wow, yeah. That city was larger than any European city at the time. It's incredible.
Near present-day St. Louis. It's amazing to think about.
And that massive earthen mound, Monk's Mound. What can you tell us about the people who built such an incredible place?
Well, they had this hierarchical system called a chiefdom.
A chiefdom.
Yeah, basically hereditary leaders with spiritual and political authority.
So a pretty organized society.
Very organized. And Cahokia was a major hub for trade and cultural exchange, too. There's evidence of interactions spanning the entire continent.
Really? Wow. So they weren't isolated by any means.
Not at all. The American Yawp talks about this practice of captive trading in some native societies.
It sounds pretty intense, but it wasn't the same as chattel slavery, right?
No, not at all. It was very different from European slavery.
So how did it work?
Well, captives were often integrated into kinship networks, maybe through adoption or marriage.
Interesting.
Yeah. And they could eventually gain full membership in the community.
So it was more about replenishing populations and strengthening social bonds?
Exactly. It wasn't about treating humans as property.
That's a really important distinction. It makes you wonder what other aspects of indigenous cultures we might be misinterpreting or just overlooking completely.
I think about that all the time. Like the Ojibwe people used birch bark scrolls, and the Inca had these knotted cords called quipu for record keeping.
It makes you wonder what else is out there.
Exactly. There's so much more to learn. It's like peeling back layers of history.
And realizing there's always more to discover.
Exactly.
So we've seen these massive cities, complex trade networks, but now we're shifting gears a bit.
Oh, yeah.
The American Yawp takes us to the eastern woodlands and the Pacific Northwest.
Okay.
And things look a little different there,
Yeah,
right?
you're not going to find those huge settlements we were just talking about.
Instead, you've got these smaller, more dispersed communities.
Right, really adapting to their specific environments.
Exactly. And they developed unique social structures, too, like the Lenape people.
Oh, the Lenape. Fascinating group.
They lived along the Delaware and Hudson River watersheds, and they had this really interesting approach to decision-making.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
Well, get this. They practiced consensus-based governance.
Wow, really? Consensus?
Yeah, their leaders, called sachems, they guided through wisdom and diplomacy, not force.
Huh. That's pretty different from how things were done in Europe at the time.
Totally. Another, kinship ties were matrilineal,
Meaning?
meaning women held a lot of influence in Lenape society.
Interesting.
Yeah, they controlled agricultural production, managed households, and even had a say in choosing leaders.
Wow, so a very different social structure.
Yeah, a real contrast to the patriarchal societies dominating Europe.
For sure.
And on top of all that, they were incredibly skilled farmers and fishers.
Making the most of those abundant eastern woodlands, huh?
Exactly. And speaking of abundance, we can't forget the salmon-rich rivers of the Pacific Northwest.
Oh yeah, salmon was central to those cultures.
Absolutely. They had such a deep reverence for it. I mean, it was at the heart of their way of life.
Imagine those massive cedar canoes, bringing in the salmon that sustained entire communities.
That's an incredible image.
And then there were the potlatches. Have you heard about those?
Oh, yeah, those elaborate feasts
Where hosts would shower their guests with gifts.
to show off their wealth and status, right?
That was part of it, sure, but it was also about reciprocity and strengthening community bonds.
So not just individual accumulation.
Exactly. It's a different way of thinking about social hierarchy.
Really fascinating how these cultures, from the Puebloans to the Lenape to the Pacific Northwest tribes, each one thriving in its own way.
Yeah, incredible diversity.
But of course, things were about to change drastically with the arrival of Europeans.
Right, a whole new chapter was about to begin.
The American Yawp helps us understand what was happening in Europe that led to this expansion across the Atlantic.
There was a lot going on.
It wasn't just about finding new lands, right?
Oh, it was way more complicated than that. You had the Renaissance going on.
A reawakening of intellectual curiosity.
Exactly. And this thirst for knowledge, for new discoveries.
And at the same time, there was this huge demand for Asian goods,
Spices, silks, you name it.
which fueled this desire for new trade routes.
They wanted to bypass those traditional land routes controlled by the Ottomans and find a way to get to Asia directly.
And on top of all that, you had all these rising nation states.
All competing for power and resources.
It really was a recipe for expansion.
Absolutely. And Portugal was leading the charge in maritime exploration.
Oh, yeah. Prince Henry the Navigator and all that.
Exactly. They were pushing advancements in shipbuilding and navigation, establishing forts along the African coast.
Almost like a preview of the colonization that was to come.
Yeah, it's kind of chilling to think about it that way. And don't forget about their sugar plantations on the Atlantic island.
Oh, right. Those relied heavily on enslaved African labor.
A dark foreshadowing of what was to unfold in the Americas.
It's a tragic pattern, isn't it?
Sadly, yes. And then you have Columbus entering the scene.
Who, as the American Yawp points out, wasn't even trying to discover a new continent.
Right. He was looking for a westward route to Asia.
He was way off in his calculations.
I underestimated the size of the Earth, basically.
His discovery was a mix of ambition, miscalculation.
And a whole lot of luck.
But whatever the reasons, his arrival set in motion a chain of events that would have devastating consequences for indigenous peoples.
There's no denying that. His initial encounters with the Arawak people in the Caribbean.
They started off peacefully enough, right?
Yeah, at first. But Columbus's true intentions were clear. He was all about extracting wealth and exploiting these newfound lands.
His journals are pretty revealing, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. He saw the Arawaks as naive, easily manipulated, ripe for conversion and enslavement.
That whole sense of European superiority.
Sadly, it became a hallmark of colonization. And of course, we can't forget the devastating impact of European diseases.
Smallpox, measles, influenza.
The Arawaks had no immunity.
It led to widespread death, the near annihilation of their population.
It's a heartbreaking chapter of history. The scale of suffering is difficult to even imagine.
It's a story that's often glossed over, though.
But it's crucial to understand the role disease played in paving the way for European conquest.
And as news of the Spanish conquest spread, it triggered this flood of fortune seekers.
All hungry for land, gold, power.
Driven by this insatiable greed, they implemented the encomienda system,
a brutal system of forced labor.
which pushed indigenous populations to the brink.
It was all about exploitation and subjugation. The Spanish essentially granted conquistadors control over indigenous people.
And their land.
Exactly. It was a recipe for abuse.
And even when the encomienda system was officially abolished, it was replaced by the repartimiento, which still exploited indigenous labor.
Yeah, the Spanish crown tried to regulate these systems, but
But the reality on the ground was different.
very different. The vast distances, the thirst for wealth among the colonists.
Genuine oversight was nearly impossible.
Basically, the exploitation continued and indigenous communities continued to suffer.
And all this was happening as the Spanish were encountering the remnants of the Maya and the powerful Aztec and Inca empires.
These weren't small, scattered communities. These were complex societies.
With vast cities and impressive knowledge.
They were far more sophisticated than anything the Spanish had encountered in the Caribbean.
Take the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan,
Oh, a magnificent city.
built on a series of islands in Lake Texcoco.
Canals instead of streets, towering temples, bustling marketplaces.
It must have been an incredible sight to behold.
The Spanish accounts describe it as a marvel, unlike anything they'd ever seen, and yet they were determined to conquer it.
The story of Hernán Cortés and the conquest of the Aztec Empire.
A tale of betrayal, cunning, and the exploitation of existing political divisions.
Cortés was a master manipulator.
He really was. He exploited those resentments, the people who had been subjugated by the Aztecs.
Forged alliances that swelled his ranks.
And then, of course, there was smallpox,
Ripping through Tenochtitlan.
weakening the Aztecs' defenses.
Disease, that invisible weapon.
It played a huge role in European dominance.
And it wasn't just the Aztecs. The Inca Empire in South America met a similar fate at the hands of Francisco Pizarro.
Sadly, yes. They too were unprepared for the onslaught of European technology and disease.
The conquest was swift and brutal.
The end of an era, and in the aftermath, the Spanish established their infamous Sistema de Castas,
That rigid social hierarchy.
categorizing people based on their perceived racial purity. At the top were the Peninsulares, born in Spain.
Followed by the Criollos, their American-born descendants.
Then came the mestizos, those of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry.
And at the very bottom,
Indigenous people and enslaved Africans. A system built on oppression. But the American Yawp points out that interracial marriage was actually quite common in Spanish America.
really?
Yeah. It led to the rise of this unique mestizo culture, with traditions like the veneration of the Virgin de Guadalupe.
The Virgin de Guadalupe,
A dark-skinned Virgin Mary.
who appeared to an indigenous man.
Exactly. She became a symbol of this new blended culture.
A testament to the resilience of indigenous beliefs, even in the face of colonization.
Absolutely. And from there, the Spanish continued their northward expansion.
Driven by those rumors of gold and that insatiable thirst for conquest.
Juan Ponce de León, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. These figures led expeditions across vast stretches of North America.
Often leaving a trail of violence and exploitation in their wake.
Unfortunately, yes. These expeditions often resulted in the enslavement and forced labor of indigenous communities.
A dark chapter in the story of exploration.
Fueled by greed and a sense of entitlement to the lands and resources of the Americas.
But North America didn't offer the same immediate riches as the empires of Central and South America.
That's right. The Spanish did establish some settlements in Florida and the Southwest,
But their primary focus remained on exploiting the wealth of Mexico and Peru.
where the gold and silver mines, along with indigenous labor, generated enormous profits.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Uh.
we've seen a pre-Columbian America that was incredibly diverse, sophisticated, and resilient.
A vibrant tapestry of cultures.
Yeah, but we've also witnessed the beginnings of this tragic clash of cultures.
Fueled by European expansion and a disregard for indigenous life and sovereignty.
Wow, we've really journeyed through some intense history in this deep dive. It's hard to grasp the sheer scale of change that happened during that period.
Yeah, the scope is mind-boggling, isn't it? And while we've talked about the violence and the exploitation that came with European arrival...
We can't ignore the other side of that coin, right?
Exactly, the Columbian Exchange.
This exchange of plants, animals, and ideas.
Between the Americas and the Old World,
It really had a profound impact on both hemispheres.
Oh, absolutely. For better and for worse,
Right, it wasn't all negative. I mean, the American Yawp really gets into how American crops transformed Europe and the rest of the world.
Like imagine Italian food without tomatoes.
Right. Or think about how potatoes changed the diet and the history of Ireland.
It's amazing to think those staples of our modern diet, potatoes, tomatoes, corn,
They all originated in the Americas.
they fueled population growth and transformed cuisines around the world.
And then on the flip side, Europeans introduced horses to the Americas, which had a huge impact on the cultures of the Great Plains.
Oh, for sure.
It's such a complex legacy, right? With these positive and negative aspects all tangled up together.
Absolutely. It's a mixed bag.
But amidst all this change, indigenous peoples showed incredible resilience.
Oh, without a doubt. They weren't just passive victims.
No, they adapted their ways of life
Forged new alliances.
and resisted European encroachment.
in countless ways.
Their stories are about survival, innovation, and enduring cultural strength.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into indigenous America, what would you say is the most important takeaway? What do you hope our listeners will keep thinking about?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is recognizing the complexity of this history,
Not just simplifying it.
Exactly. The Americas weren't some empty wilderness waiting to be discovered.
They were already home to a vibrant tapestry of cultures.
With their own unique histories, beliefs, and ways of life.
It's about challenging those old narratives that paint indigenous peoples as simple or primitive.
Absolutely. And understanding that the arrival of Europeans, while devastating in many ways,
It also triggered this exchange.
that reshaped the world.
And we're still feeling the effects today.
Without a doubt, it's a history filled with tragedy, but also
Resilience.
an adaptation.
I always find it fascinating how these deep dives uncover connections and complexities we might never have considered before.
It's eye-opening, isn't it?
It really makes you want to keep learning
Keep exploring.
and keep questioning those old assumptions.
Couldn't agree more. It's the beauty of history. It's a constant process of discovery and reevaluation.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Indigenous America. We hope it sparked a curiosity in you, our listener, to delve even deeper into this rich and multifaceted history.
Until next time.
Keep exploring.